Today I want to talk about Canada's latest population numbers, particularly immigration and non-permanent residents. Since I started my video series on the Canadian housing bubble, I've gotten a lot of comments from people asking, "When are you going to talk about the immigrants?" And this is that video. But I'll tell you right now, if you are one of those commenters, you're probably not going to like this video that much. I know that on Fridays I normally do a variety of different stories, but the new population numbers from Statcan are pretty surprising, and it's an important story that we urgently need to have a grown-up conversation about. Before we get into it, I want to be very clear that this is not an anti-immigration video. I think people who are calling for extreme actions like a total moratorium on immigration are impractical and counterproductive. However, my opinion is that government policy over the past 15 years or so has continuously become more and more an exploitation of immigrants, particularly non-permanent residents. They're using it as a way to bring cheap labor and cash into the country with no regard for the well-being of the people we're inviting or the people who are already here. There needs to be some nuance to this discussion in terms of how many people we're actually capable of welcoming to the country, as well as how those people are being treated. Let's start off with the numbers from the third quarter of 2023, which were released this week. Canada's population increased by 430,635 people in 3 months. Of that, 96% was due to international migration, with 4% coming from natural population increase. On a percentage basis, this was the fastest increase in population since 1957, which was associated with the post-war baby boom and refugees arriving from the Hungarian Revolution. Of the international migration, about 108,000 was in the form of new permanent residents, with over 312,000 coming from a net increase in non-permanent residents like international students and temporary workers. That net amount breaks down into about 464,000 non-permanent residents arriving and 152,000 leaving. This is a chart I made of the net flow of non-permanent residents going back to 2000. You can see a very obvious spike in the last 6 quarters. In fact, in the last year and a half, we've increased the number of non-permanent residents in the country by more than we did over the previous 22 years combined. While the government is focused on the growing number of new permanent residents in the country, according to CD Howe, 58% of the record-breaking population growth in 2022 came from temporary residents, students and workers, rather than permanent immigration. And based on data from Statcan and the IRCC, in 2023 we're on pace for even more population growth and a higher proportion of non-permanent residents. For some context, back in 2019, Statcan saw a rapid increase in non-permanent residents happening and decided to do some projections on what that might look like going forward. This is a chart of their low, medium, and high projections for the non-permanent resident population. They included a source data table in their report, so I used that to recreate their chart, and then I overlaid it with what actually happened. As you can see, their estimates were a little bit on the low side compared to what we're seeing now. I would even go so far as to call our current trend unsustainable. So, what the hell is going on? For years now, we've seen a trend of universities and colleges, but particularly colleges, recruiting international students in order to bring in more tuition fees to compensate for stagnant public funding. For example, since 2014, the University of Waterloo has seen a 62% increase in international students, Wilfrid Laurier University had a 66% increase, and Conestoga College had a 1,579% increase. From January 2022 to April 2023, just 2 Ontario colleges, Conestoga and Centennial, had more student visas approved than all of Canada's U15 research universities combined. In fact, student recruitment has become an entire industry in India, where colleges in Canada will pay a commission for each student that recruiters send to them. Oftentimes, these students are coming from rural families who mortgage their family's land to scrape together the money to send their child to school in Canada with the promise of a good education, job opportunities, and a better lifestyle. However, when they actually get here, they find that they're going to college in a strip mall with poor work prospects and living in substandard rental housing. As an example of substandard housing, this student from Nepal was paying $500 a month to share a mattress on the floor of a basement in Scarborough. Incidentally, he's also paying $25,000 a year in tuition to study construction management at college. Of course, there are minimum rental housing standards that are supposed to be maintained, but they're rarely enforced, and if they were enforced, it would likely push many of these students into homelessness, so they don't really have much recourse against crooked landlords. At the same time this has been happening, we've been seeing students from India making up a larger and larger part of the student visa program, growing from roughly 5% to 40% over the past 15 years. Meanwhile, our historically largest source of international students, China, has declined to about a third of its former share. Interestingly, we're also seeing a significant increase in students coming from the Philippines, from about 2,000 students in 2015 to over 32,000 in 2022. Historically, India and the Philippines have each been a significant portion of our temporary foreign worker program, so there's a pretty good chance that the student visa program is now being used as an alternative path to get a work permit. Some people like to say these student visa holders are scamming the system, but the government has been aware of this for years and years, and did they do anything to stop it? No. Instead, they lifted the cap on the number of hours international students could work off campus. Did they do this to help students manage the skyrocketing cost of living? No, according to them it was to help address the labor shortage by effectively turning these students into temporary foreign workers. So, Canada still gets the cheap labor, but they also get to collect the modern equivalent of a head tax through tuition fees. Speaking of which, on top of student visas, we also have the temporary foreign worker and international mobility programs, which have been expanding rapidly since the 2000s. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program allows companies to hire workers from outside the country on a temporary basis, nominally to address short-term skill and labor shortages. To qualify as an employer, you need to have a labor market impact assessment done, which shows that there are no Canadian citizens or permanent residents available to fill the position, and if using foreign labor will have a positive or negative impact on the local labor market. However, this is pretty much treated as a rubber stamp application, which is why so many TFWs end up working in sectors like retail and food service. The International Mobility Program, on the other hand, is exempt from the requirement for a labor market impact assessment, which makes it even cheaper and easier for employers. This program covers post-graduation work permits for international students, as well as work permits for countries that we have reciprocal labor agreements with. Incidentally, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program was recently described as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery by UN Special Rapporteur Tomoya Obokata. One of the big reasons for this is that aside from post-graduation permits, most of these are issued as closed work permits, which means the work permit is associated with a specific employer and a specific job, meaning the employer has almost total control over the worker's immigration status, which drastically increases the potential for exploitation. That makes student visas an attractive alternative route to get a work permit because the study permit work allowance is an open work permit, meaning the worker can change employers at will without losing their status at the cost of having to enroll in an educational program. And according to the CD Howe report I mentioned earlier, these low-cost exploitable workers, international students and work permit holders, now make up about 7 to 8% of Canada's entire labour force as of 2022. To start wrapping up, I generally don't like to bring up politics, but I know already that the comments section is going to be full of people saying that this is liberal immigration policy and blaming the whole thing on Trudeau and saying that voting Conservative will fix everything. I think it's important to point out that if you actually look into it, the Conservative and Liberal parties have pretty much always been aligned on immigration targets and just argue about exactly what type of workers we should be seeking. In fact, when the Liberals uncapped work hours for student visa holders, the Conservative immigration critics said that they should have lifted the cap earlier and they should be clearing the backlog by bringing in more people faster to address the labour shortage, and address the affordability crisis somehow. Back in 2014, Justin Trudeau wrote an op-ed in the Toronto Star saying we need to downsize the TFW program to get things under control and reduce exploitation. Instead, his government has continued to expand the program, again to address the labour shortage. My question to you is, do we really believe that a labour shortage crisis exists? Are we seeing positions going unfilled for long periods of time? Are we seeing workers getting multiple job offers? Are we seeing employers actively giving out raises and bonuses to attract and retain skilled labour? These are the sort of things you'd expect if we truly had a shortage of workers, but I haven't been seeing it, and my guess is neither have you. Instead, we're seeing hundreds of international students lining up for minimum wage jobs, which seems like a very strange situation amidst a supposed labour shortage. So who benefits from this? In my opinion, rapidly expanding the population of temporary residents as a source of cheap labor isn't benefiting new immigrants, immigrants who are already here, or people who are born here. Instead, it's benefiting companies that want low-cost, easily exploitable labor, and people who provide essential services to those workers like landlords and grocery corporations who are free to engage in price gouging under the premise of supply and demand. Unfortunately, both of our major political parties are more or less entirely composed of wealthy, well-connected people who benefit from this situation, including a pretty large contingent of MPs who are landlords. They aren't going to see this as a problem unless we, as voters, make it a problem for them. If all we do is vote for the opposite party and wait for them to fix everything, they're just going to keep making excuses. Right now, the federal government is pointing their fingers at provinces and colleges, but realistically, immigration is the jurisdiction of the federal government. They issue the study and work permits, and they could easily adjust how and when those are issued. I think we need to reject the false dichotomy that more immigration is always pro-immigrant and less immigration is always anti-immigrant. Like it or not, there's a finite number of people that we're capable of ethically welcoming to the country while still being able to offer them a dignified lifestyle. We need to have a grown-up discussion about this issue right now instead of yelling at each other like children, and an important part of that discussion is getting the input of international students and temporary workers themselves to really see what kind of conditions they're living under. The line between welcoming immigrants and exploiting immigrants is wide and blurry, but in my opinion, we've firmly crossed over into exploitation territory, and we need to be more widely aware of it and reverse the trend before things get worse. There's really so much more to this topic, and when I have time I'd like to make something closer to a half-hour video on it. For now, you'll have to settle for this shortened version, but as I like to say, the more you know, the worse it gets. If you want to know more on the subject of the exploitation pipeline from India to Canada, I highly recommend this article called The Shadowy Business of International Education, written by Nicholas Honeybrown back in 2021. Anyway, that's it for this week. I'm going to be away for a couple of weeks, but enjoy the holiday season, have a happy new year, and I'll see you in 2024.